They're on the road, Cleopas and the other unnamed disciple, and then Jesus meets them, and they don't know who Jesus is, and that's where the story ends, right? And then kind of a new story, although it's a continuation, or the second part of the story picks up, and that's where I'll read from 28 through the rest of the 35th verse. Listen to the conclusion of this story. Now they came near to the village Emmaus. They had walked that whole 7 miles to which they were going, and Jesus, the one they didn't know was Jesus, walked a little bit ahead as if he were going on. But the 2 disciples, something about it, they urged him to stop strongly. They said, "Stay with us. It's almost evening. This day is now nearly over." So he went with them. He went in with them and he stayed with them. And when he was at the table, he took the bread, he blessed it, he broke it, and he gave it to them, and then their eyes were immediately opened. They recognized him. And then he vanished from their sight. They said to one another, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening up the scriptures to each of us?" Now, remember, it was late, but at that same hour they got up and they returned to Jerusalem. 7 miles they ran, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together, and they were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he appeared to Simon." And they said, "Let us tell you a story." Then they told him what had happened on the road and how he had been known to them at the table in the breaking of the bread. This is the word of the Lord. So I'm going to stand down here to preach today because this story is a story of movement, but it's also a story that happens at the table. Long ago, the table around which Jesus gathered with those 2 disciples, maybe more. And it's a story that happens kind of in 2 parts, right? It happens on the road, and then it happens in the house. They get on the road to Emmaus, and then they actually get to Emmaus. And so we're going to talk about what that means and how that still plays out today as we are still trying to figure out what it's like to be the post-Easter church. What is the post-Easter church? Well, a long time ago when I was in divinity school, a preaching professor said, "If somebody else has said it better than you, then stop talking and let them speak." So I'm going to let Barbara Brown Taylor start our sermon this morning, and she actually preaches a beautiful sermon about this. And so I want you to listen. It's called Blessed Brokenness. She starts out and she says, Luke's story of what happened on the road to Emmaus is one of 7 post-resurrection stories that we find in all 4 of the Gospels. And like all of them, this and all the rest of them, it's a little ghostly. Remember that part about Jesus just vanishing? The stranger whom the disciples do not recognize at first, who turns out to be the Messiah, he vanishes from their sight as soon as they know who he is. Now, on the other hand, the crucifixion stories are nothing like this. They are 100% solid. Jesus is nailed to the cross. They put a nameplate tacked above his head. He dies in front of at least 100 witnesses. There is no case of mistaken identity here. There are no sudden appearances or disappearances. His death is real. Now, his resurrection, on the other hand, is largely a rumor. Someone said his tomb was empty. But that can mean anything, right? Maybe his body was stolen. Maybe he revived and walked away. It was the women who first spread the story, and everybody knows how they embellish things. Even those who saw him in the flesh, they had a hard time convincing anyone else it was true. Remember our friend Thomas? Doubting Thomas, we all know him as. He didn't buy it. He didn't buy it until he had seen it for himself. And the 7 resurrection stories don't go very far. Think about this. Jesus didn't appear to everyone, did he? Before he ascended into heaven. He left plenty of people to weigh the evidence for themselves, to listen to the testimony of those who were there, and to decide this. To decide if and what they would believe. That, in a nutshell, is the situation of the post-Easter church. It was the situation Luke faced in his own church. It was the churches of the other gospel writers as well. It's what Paul actually spends the majority of his letters writing about to the churches in Asia Minor. It is our situation today, Barbara Brown Taylor writes. None of us were there, were we? We were not there for the real death and the rumored resurrection. So all of us have a decision to make. We have a decision to make about the truth of what we have heard. So we all have a decision to make about the truth of the resurrection. What do you believe? I would imagine that your first response, if I asked you, what is it that you believe? You would say, I believe in the resurrection, and I'm here, Ben. Look at the faithful here on the first Sunday after Easter, which is known publicly in the Presbyterian Church, and I'm sure other churches, as Associate Sunday, right? The low Sunday of the year. When I was an associate at Westminster, it was the Sunday we used to fight over. We would sort of jockey position. I'll preach that one. I'll preach that one, right? You're here. You believe in the resurrection. That's what you believe. That's a defensive question to start out with. But the truth of the matter is, it's a question that the disciples were trying to ponder as well. And it's what actually launches us on to the road with them. The part that Chauncey read just a little bit ago, do you remember? They were trying to figure out what was going on. They had just witnessed one of the greatest things in the world, the resurrection. They had heard about it, but they couldn't believe. They were reminiscing, they were sharing their stories of what had happened. Was it true? Was that the way it was supposed to happen? And as they're walking along, Jesus, unbeknownst to them, walks with them. So maybe the road is where we find out what it is that we believe. The road will teach you. When I was in college and also in graduate school, and about a year ago, every so often I read the book On the Road by Jack Kerouac. You may know the book. It's a great book for those that need a little adventure, right? Jack Kerouac was a beat writer from the Beat generation, and he was very anti-institutional, and he was all about the adventure. He was literally about the road. If you couldn't find your purpose in New York, drive to San Francisco. If that wasn't there, then go to Mexico. If you don't have a car, get on a train. It's a wonderful story, except for the fact that every place you go doesn't fulfill you, right? It's all about the journey, Kerouac would say, but for those of us on the road, we don't get much, right? And that plays into the text for today. You get on the road and you want to find the answers, but there's that small little tidbit of information, and that's that the disciples don't recognize Jesus. If we're supposed to find out what we believe on the road, how are we, 2,000 years removed, supposed to recognize Jesus, supposed to know what we believe if his own two disciples cannot remember who he is? Do you not think they would have heard his voice and it would have recognized something? Or the way he walked? I have to imagine, don't you think Jesus had a particular way of walking? They had been with him for 3 years, maybe 3 more years. And they knew what he was about. They had seen him perform miracles. They had heard him preach. They had heard him teach. And they don't recognize him. What chance do we have to know what we believe? The road is not the place, right? It's the table. The part of the story that Chauncey ended with the road and I picked it up at the table, that's where we got to be, right? When he breaks the bread, that's how you know what you believe. Come to church is the subliminal message. Come inside the church and you'll learn what it is you believe and how you believe it. What is your truth? This is where we find it. Right at the table. Breaking of the bread. The reading of Scripture. The baptizing. The education. The outreach. The mission. That's where you'll learn what you believe. That's the message that we want to proclaim to the world as the church, right? Come inside and learn what it is you believe. That's where Jesus made himself known to the disciples, right? They did it at the table. So come to the table. But do you remember that other part? As soon as you want to settle in with this text it's all about getting to Emmaus, Luke takes us back to the road. Remember that part that Chauncey read about where their hearts, something happened to their hearts while they were walking. When he was teaching and when he was preaching and when he was talking to them, something happened to their hearts, and it takes you back to the road. Jesus actually meets them first on the road. He makes himself known around the table, yes, but he also teaches and preaches on the road. So as soon as you want to settle into the table, this is what we believe right here, in these walls, in these pews. The text takes us back outside to the road. I was thinking about that this week. Wednesday of this past week was my 8th anniversary of ordination. I was ordained 8 years ago in Denver, Colorado. And I remember it very vividly because you may not know this, but Denver weather is much like the South. There was a crazy snowstorm, and there was 5 feet of snow on Friday and Saturday. And on Sunday, we had to open the windows of the church because it was 70 degrees. It was a wild, crazy weekend of weather. And I remember my family sat up front around here in this part of the church, and I remember all the people gathered there. But what I remember most were the little rocks that the youth gave out. They gave out little common rocks. I'm not sure where they found them, probably outside the church or maybe at their own homes. And they found rocks and they had put crosses on them. Everybody who entered the sanctuary, they gave them a rock, and they gave me 2 because they thought I was special, which I took 2, and that was good. And I still have those rocks, and I thought about those this week on the road to Emmaus. Because what do we do when we walk down the road? We try to avoid the rocks. The big ones, those are easy. You just walk around them. But when you're walking along, do you ever step on the smallest of rocks and it hurts like right behind your ear? They're painful. So we try to avoid them as best we can, and if we're walking with someone, particularly if you're a parent and you're walking with a child, you try to keep them from stumbling on the rocks because they always hit their knees. It's always the knees. So you try to avoid those rocks. Get off the road with as little pain as possible. But then they put those crosses on the rocks, and I keep thinking about that. That takes me into the church where we meet Christ around the table. But the rock takes me back out to the road. And there seems to be this tension between getting off the road and getting into the church, getting around the table. But the truth of the matter is, I think Luke's trying to bring them together. Because think about where Jesus met the disciples on the road. Chauncey read it very eloquently about they met Jesus in the most broken point in their lives. The Greek is actually translated that they stopped still when they met Jesus. What do you mean you don't know what's going on? They were so overcome with guilt, they were so overcome with wonder and disappointment and sadness that they had to stop. And that's where Jesus meets them, in the most broken point in their lives. And then Jesus actually makes himself known at what point? When he breaks the bread. When he takes the formula that he uses in the loaves and fishes and the Lord's Supper when he institutes it on Maundy, Thursday. Take, eat, broken for you and given to you. Sometimes we want to get off the road and get into here because this is where it's safer, but the reality is that we're broken out there and we're also broken in here. What we believe, to be honest with you, is that Jesus meets us in our brokenness. When our team loses, when our candidate doesn't win, when a relationship goes terribly wrong, when the brokenness of our lives happen, that's when we learn who Jesus is. That's when we learn what we believe. Sometimes the road to Emmaus story sets up a tension between the road out there and the church inside. But Luke wants them to bring them together. In the brokenness of our own lives, that's how Jesus makes himself known. He made himself known on that first Easter, and he continues to make himself known. May God bless this witness, and may God bless this congregation. Amen.